it's a dopamine hit every 30 seconds. That, that swipe, 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 swipe. And that has shrunk our attention spans. And I said, you know what? We're not going to wait to raise funds. We're not going to wait to put a newsroom. We're going to start working from home. And we started working from home. And now with social media, we're feeling the trauma of the entire world. The first time it happens, it's scary. Like, why are 1,000 people calling me this word? And then you realize they've all misspelled that word. So it's all from the same source.
Hello, and welcome to another episode of my show. My guest today is Faye D'Souza, someone who's redefined the media landscape by moving out of traditional journalism and creating a space of her own in this digital world. She's constantly breaking new grounds and news, of course. Her journey is all about excitement, about constant reinvention, and about making a real impact. Faye, it's such a pleasure to have you here.
It's a pleasure to speak with you. And I think I was telling someone from your team when I walked in that the last time you and I met was about 16 or 17 years ago when I interviewed you.
That's right.
So this is amazing. It's such a pleasure. Thank you for having me.
We've always, as audience, admired and enjoyed you asking questions to people. And now today you're on the other side of it. So I think it's going to be a joy to flip the script and ask you questions. So let's dive in.
Yes.
Tell me, how did you get into journalism? In the sense that, was there a moment, was there a person who inspired you to pursue truth even when you were younger?
So I had actually grown up in a home that valued education above everything else, like most of us. And I have an older sister who went to Mount Carmel College in Bangalore and topped the university, Bangalore University, and won several gold medals in her BCom and then went on to do her MBA. She was very impressive. And then I wound up at the doorstep of the same college and they expected that I will be similarly impressive. So I was ushered in to study statistics and mathematics and accounts, which I was fairly good at, but my heart was not in it.
Okay.
And the college that I was in had a lot of room for expression.
Okay.
So there were, professors who would encourage us to read more, who taught us poetry, who taught us, literature, who encouraged debate. And I found myself leaning further and further towards that world. And this was also a time when television had just started in India. The greats were still writing in the newspapers. Journalism was that noble profession where you went if you wanted to really make a difference and you wanted to change the world or just your city or just your street, as the case may be.
Yeah.
So I finished my +2 and I announced to my parents that I was going to shift to BA, which was back then considered a very unpopular thing to do. But I really wanted to study journalism. And my mother was so disappointed that she didn't come to the admission interview. She said, I want no part in this. So my dad was kind enough to come with me. And I switched out and studied English literature, journalism, and psychology. There were 3 majors. That's how that course was designed back then, and did a BA. And somewhere in my bones, I knew that this is what I wanted to do. After that, I did a master's in mass communication. And while I was doing my master's, I read the news at All India Radio for 2 years as a part-time sort of news reader. So I have some Prasar Bharati experience, which is fairly rare and is so old school that it's quite fascinating. So when I finished, I actually television was not my first choice. I thought I'd work for a newspaper or radio, but radio doesn't do news in India other than outside of, AIR and Prasar Bharati. So I got a job after much hunting because it was very difficult. There were few channels back then. I got a job at CNBC TV 18 and started off as a runt at the bottom, producer and then a reporter who was tracking insurance. And this was 2004 and 5. And this is after spending 6 months doing a lot of other grunt work before they allow you anywhere near a camera.
Okay.
But I loved it. And I loved being a reporter. I loved, and in the insurance sector, it's sort of, I found myself moving closer towards consumer rights, people who are not getting their claims even after they've paid their premium. Some portions of those, insurance contracts that were unfair. So somehow, citizens' rights
Seeking.
was my, was the space that I was drawn towards. So that's how I actually became a journalist.
Interesting. You spoke about All India Radio and you
Yeah.
spoke about television. So, in a way, actually, you transitioned from All India Radio to television and to digital world. You think this, in a way, reflects the way, there's a shift in the way news is consumed?
So there's definitely a change in the way news is consumed, and for multiple reasons. One, primarily, there's a technological disruption.
Right.
People have their mobile phones in their hands, and this happened a few years ago. And you no longer need to go to a television and switch it on or wait for your paper to come the next day to find out anything at all. It's right in your hand. So these two forms of communication have been defunct completely. They're still around, and I'm saying it, but honestly, they're still around. Nobody really knows why. And I think that's the major thing that has changed. The second thing that has changed is there is a definite, especially among the younger audience, a mistrust and a lack of credibility towards mainstream media. And this is not an Indian phenomenon, although it's quite pronounced in India. It's happening overseas as well. So it's the independent sources that younger people tend to trust more. And that's a global sort of movement that's happened right now, even with the Western media. So I think these two things combined has created a disruption that it's still yet to settle into a new sort of paradigm. Because in digital also, people are still figuring out, how do I tell the difference between what is true and what is not fact-checked? How do I tell the difference between someone who's just producing content and someone who's actually a journalist? And the new wave is going to hit us before we know it, and that's AI. And AI is going to bring with it a whole tsunami of fake news that I honestly believe the world is not prepared for. The pace at which that will hit us, but that's a separate conversation. So I think that we're in the middle of a change, and it's going to change even further going forward.
So this change that you're talking about, I think, as I observe the younger generation, I also feel that even in news, what they're looking for is personalization.
Yes.
They're looking for immediacy. But also all this is kind of creating an information overload. Now, do you think that this information overload is also causing, the shortening attention span that the generation has, or is it probably the other way around, that attention spans are anyway decreasing, so that's why they are consuming a lot of news but in shorter pieces? I mean, how do you see this?
So I think it was Barack Obama in his first term actually who had said that the commodity that will be in most shortage or most sought after will be attention spans, right?
Yes.
And I think that there is something to the fact that all communication has now gone down to the reel format, which is 30 seconds.
Yeah.
I mean, it's unthinkable to have to communicate anything in 30 seconds. Earlier, you had to watch an entire television show for a whole hour to be able to get that one moment that made you feel something beautiful. Now, someone will cut out that moment and give it to you in that 30 seconds, right? So it's almost like it's a dopamine hit every 30 seconds.
Yes.
That swipe, 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 swipe. And that has shrunk our attention spans to a point where I don't think anyone is reading anymore like they used to. People don't have the bandwidth to really give to anything anymore. There are very few sources of entertainment or information that are able to hold someone's attention for longer. That's the real challenge, that we're coming into. I believe that it's also happened to news, but the impact of that has been there is a definite loss of nuance in a news
Mhm.
story
Mhm.
because people just want it all immediately. Like, tell me immediately, tell me quickly what
Yes.
happened. I
Yes.
don't have the bandwidth.
Mm.
So it's really important before you form your opinion on something to be able to understand all of the aspects of that particular story. So, for example, all over the world, people are getting politically divided based on their points of view. Are you a liberal person or are you a conservative right winger? This has happened all over Europe. It's happened all over Australia. It's happened in the US, as we've seen. And so what's happened is now you're getting pigeonholed.
Hmm.
That, oh, okay, because you believe in this one thing, you probably believe in this whole gamut of liberal ideas. Or because you believe in this one thing, you're probably entirely right wing, which is not true.
Hmm.
Each of us is a nuanced individual. It's possible for me to be a pro choice person, but don't entirely agree with some of the arguments being made by the liberal side.
Hmm.
We're sort of losing that nuance.
Hmm.
Everybody's being pigeonholed, everybody's just been shoved from one compartmentalized. And we run the risk of raising new generations of people who are being forced into boxes
compartment.
before they have the opportunity to fully
Make up their
understand, make up
mind.
their mind, truly appreciate arguments from both sides, decide differently on different, aspects. So there are different kinds of audiences. The challenge for news will be to hold attention.
Hmm.
So you're right that is, that is going to be something that will keep coming up because the length at which we write comes down further and further and further. Uh, the length at which we are able to communicate, a story to the audience comes down further and further and further. That becomes the challenge.
One more challenge could be, this whole worry about fake news. We are all kind of trying to find what is the truth.
Yeah.
For you, as a journalist, how do you make sure that what you're presenting are the correct facts? How do you do your fact checking?
So, I mean, I have an evolving process. I used to say I have a process, but I've realized that I have to keep improving that process
as well.
because we get, blindsided on a regular basis. So we do a 2 and now a 3 level fact check, which
Mhm.
means that if information, so the argument is if something big happens, it's going to pop up on your phone, right? So there's no shortage of information on the internet. There is a shortage of credibility on the internet.
Right.
So what we do is we slow down the process.
Mm-hmm.
So a lot of people complain to me saying, "Oh, I really like your news, but it's a little on the slower side." And that's on purpose. I'm not there to tell you immediately what happened because that is where mistakes take place because we're all human beings. And in that sort of, oh, I have to type this out fastest, I'm going to wind up making a mistake. So we slow down the process. We take in the information that's come in from a reliable source. So then we wait for a second confirmation directly from source. So, for example, if it says that this accident has taken place in a certain, so that's come from the wire, we will also wait for the police to put out a statement separately. And now with Twitter and social media, police is putting out direct to audience statements. Or we'll wait for the government to put out an official statement. So now we've got two sources. Or the third, this thing is to actually wait for the visual, actually wait for a video. The problem if the video is your first source is that sometimes videos are doctored. And so then it becomes important to, wait to see if there are more videos, if there are more confirmations, if there are police statements. So a lot of times we slow things down so we are able to get multiple confirmations until we're satisfied.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the only, that's the only way to do it. So actually, every story has its own process of, okay, I'm not satisfied. I'm not satisfied. I want one more source or I want another confirmation. Sometimes, we pick up the phone, we call police stations, we call sources, we ask them what's going on. And, do as many rounds of fact checking as until you're satisfied.
So that's very reassuring to that because I think that's really very important. Over these almost 2 decades of your
Yeah.
career, you've developed this great editorial expertise, I think, of picking the right stories and actually telling them very well as well. So,
Thank
you think it's the story that makes the difference, or you think it's the way you amplify it, tell it, explain it that creates the connect with the audience?
Actually, for me, I approach all stories imagining how this makes the audience feel. Um, Because when we, and this incidentally comes back from my days of tracking insurance and mutual funds and banking and things like that. Um, you know, because we're all at the end of the day consumers. We're consumers of government services. We're consumers of private sector services. We pay for all of the services that we use. And a lot of times when things are not delivered successfully, there is a sense of injustice. And so I go from, okay, this is happening and the audience deserves to know what is really going on here. And I imagine why this is important to the audience that's following me. And that's how I pick a story based on, this impacts a lot of people. We should tell this story. Or this is an individual whose experience impacts a lot of people and people can learn from it. And so we should tell that story. And so that is how that's how we approach a story. Recently, post my leaving television, I made a big change in how I tell my stories, especially on Instagram, which is such a small space to be able to write out a story. I've removed all personal opinion and color from it.
Okay.
And it's an exercise to do because we all have right now very, sort of vivid opinions about everything. So when I come across a story and say, okay, we're going to write this story down, I have a team member who writes it and then another person who fact checks it. And then I look at it again. And while we're writing the story, we knock out as much bias as we consciously can. There'll still be people who say, oh, you're so biased. But it's not for lack of trying. So we write it in that, I write it in that gray and black format, which is literally colorless. And we take off all opinion because for me, that is my way of respecting the audience. Because it is not my job to tell you whether this is a good thing or a bad thing. It's not my job to tell you how to feel or whether you should be angered by this or happy by this. It is only my job to tell you what has happened. And then leave it up to you and your good judgment to decide if you think this is a good thing or a bad thing or whatever. And I find that the audience, without me having explained this in so many words, has really understood that and really embraced it. And that's the relationship of respect that I have with the people who read the news that I write.
So, is it something like this? Or, I mean, what is it that drove you to set up your own platform? Do you think there is actual, independent journalism in an independent platform?
So there are so many answers to that question. So when I had left television, the initial plan was to raise funds in the startup and put up a newsroom and hire a bunch of reporters and to be able to put out the news on YouTube. That was the plan. And then COVID hit us. And suddenly we were all, locked in our homes. So there was no fundraise and there was no newsroom. And we were just sitting there. And there were two young people who left television with me, followed me. And I told them, I said, we can't be sitting through this. This is a massive event. We have to go out and report. And this was in the first wave of COVID. When India was in complete lockdown, right? You couldn't even leave your home. So then, and at that point, even the press was staying indoors. There was nobody on the streets. There was nobody in the hospitals. Nobody was telling the stories. So we got special permission from the police to leave our homes. And three of us went out. We went from hospital to hospital. We were the first set of people to go inside the COVID ICUs. To tell the stories of what was actually happening. And we shot literally on the phone that I use, my regular phone. We just put it on a selfie stick, because that's what selfie sticks were happening at that time. They don't have it anymore. We put it on a selfie stick in order to be able to get distance from the person because of COVID. And we put on the whole PPE kits at that point and we went out. And the idea was to be able to just tell stories, cover what is going on. And at that point, we met doctors who were not being allowed to go back home. We met nurses whose husbands had died because they took COVID home. And we were able to tell the stories in a way that nobody else was telling at that time. And so that's where it started from. And I said, you know what? We're not going to wait to raise funds. We're not going to wait to put a newsroom. We're going to start working from home. And we started working from home. We started using Instagram and YouTube to just tell these stories. And after a lot of soul searching of when I had left from television, I spent a lot of time figuring out, do I still want to be a journalist? Is there something else I can do?
Oh.
Is this really still my calling? What kind of journalist do I want to be? What do I want my contribution to be, to my society, to my community, to my family? And I remember I would go to this one restaurant every day with these A4 sheets of paper and actually write down the answers to these questions over
Oh.
and over again so that I'm convinced. And I realized that I have to be a journalist. I'm not qualified to be anything else. To be gainfully employed anywhere else. Um, but I also realized that the kind of journalist I wanted to be was a person who respects the integrity of my audience, who respects the dignity of the news that is being covered, of the people who are being covered in the news, of the subject matter. So I finally boiled it down to one word: dignity,
Oh, okay.
which is guaranteed to us in our constitution, that we will all be treated with dignity. And so I boiled it down saying, you know what, it's not about getting a big newsroom and setting up a big team, but it's about taking information that's already coming out and treating it with dignity, and treating the news with dignity, and treating the audience
Hmm.
with respect and dignity. So that is where this whole idea came from. Quite honestly, because the environment changes so much, on a daily basis, we're reinventing, formats and saying, should we do it this way? Should we do this video this way? Should we, but the core of dignity and integrity stays
Still
the same.
remains. But, you're talking about dignity. We spoke about the risks of fake news and so on. I think there is a journalist responsibility is to present facts and
Yes.
be factual about reporting, be objective about reporting. But we are also living in a sensitive world, and events and news can sensitize the whole environment. So, in your view, what is more important? Reporting on the basis of facts, or reporting keeping the sensitivities in mind?
Both. I don't think they have to be an either or, right?
Uh,
I think that when you call yourself a journalist,
hmm,
the facts are non-negotiable.
that's right. Yes.
I think a lot of people have
Yes.
forgotten in our profession that you have to necessarily be in the non-fiction category. You're not writing fiction. You're writing non-fiction. And the facts are non-negotiable. The other thing that we do, that my team and I do a lot on social media, is we put out trigger warnings, which is that if we're writing about suicide, if we're writing about violence, about gun violence, about domestic violence, then we put our first page will just say, trigger warning, this story is about violence. So if you're someone who finds violence triggering, don't read this story.
Mm.
Move on. Because uh, it's not my job to shock you mentally all the time.
Mm-hmm.
And you don't need to have read every story.
Right.
So there's a lot of sensitivity that needs, and we're still learning. There's a lot more that we need to do. I've noticed that once we started doing the trigger warnings, a lot of other people also started doing it, which is a good thing. So that has now become a best practice. I think that pushes the envelope forward. But I think being sensitive is really, really important. And like we were discussing earlier, contrary to my entire career, where I was told that women don't watch news, women don't read newspapers, I am so proud that on all the platforms where I exist and I put out the news, we have 50 to 52% women audience.
Oh, wow.
So on the Instagram page, we do 100 million views a month. And 50% of that comes from women.
So, very interesting. You talk about women empowerment, and we believe that you get women in the leadership role and so on and so forth, and that's women empowerment. But what you are doing is women empowerment. If you think that through your way of communicating news, you've actually got more women to become aware of current affairs and of news, that itself is empowerment. You're empowering them through their thinking and their mind.
Thank you. Thank you for that.
So-
But I think that it's important also because when you get more women, as you yourself have been a role model for so many of us, when you have women making decisions,
Yeah.
and dealing with taking calls on the content. And we have, for example, stories coming in of crime, of violent sexual crime against women, issues where women are being are affected in some way. the manner in which we write those stories, the language that we use, the dignity that we treat the subject matter with makes a difference to the person who's reading it. And that's both men and women. Because it's not like I'm doing some specific to women news. This is everybody's news.
Yes.
And quite rightly, like society, it's the audience is also 50% female,
Yes.
which is unlike the entire internet in India, which tends to be about 75-25. So, the women are there, and if communicated in a dignified manner, the women will consume that information. For me, it's such a personal thing.
Yeah.
It's a huge victory. It makes my day every time I meet a woman and she says, hey, I read the news that you put out. It changes my life.
So very proud of you for that.
Thank you.
You spoke about, your trigger warnings and how you treat news with dignity and treat audience with dignity, which is very creditable. But tell me about yourself, because, when you are looking at traumas, when you are looking at the events, people's pain, people's struggle, they come to you first. And how do you manage to keep yourself emotionally strong?
It's very hard. So there is a combination of two things. One is obviously the information that you take in. I genuinely believe that our brains were not wired to handle this much grief and this much trauma. Because, and someone explained this to me, so apparently, and this is a trigger warning, but so if I were to tell you that there's been an accident and 3 people have passed away, as a human being, you're able to imagine the grief of 3 deaths. But if I were to tell you there's been a massive incident in which 1,000 people have died, you cannot process that number. There used to be a time when you read it on the newspaper, it would be this much column somewhere in your paper, and you'd read it, and it would be a data point, and you'd say, okay, these many people, all right, you'd take it in as information, but you couldn't empathize because your brain wouldn't allow it. So you could, as a human being, feel the trauma of your family and maybe your street, and to some extent your city and your country because of what you read in your newspaper. But you couldn't possibly feel the trauma of the entire world. And now with social media, we're feeling the trauma of the entire world.
Yes.
I mean, I call this like vicarious trauma. It's happening to somebody else on the other end of the world, but we're looking at it and you're feeling every single thing. I don't know what this is going to do to us as human beings, but it's here.
Because you're seeing it, you're watching it.
Watching it.
Yeah.
And you watch one reel or one video and it will send you
It will show up
more.
more and more. Yeah.
And so you're watching more of it. And then there are some people who just block it out saying, you know what, I don't want to see any of this. But then you feel guilt because you're looking the other way. So as human beings right now, again, the internet and social media is changing a lot of things about how we consume information. For me, I don't have the choice of blocking it out. So I have to plug out on a regular basis. So I step away from it. I spend some time with the dog, or I spend some time with my child. I do other things. I cook a meal. I do things like, I exercise. I do things that take my mind off it so that it's not, you're not constantly running those images, even after you stop looking at it, running those images in my brain a lot. The second kind of trauma happens once you put out the information, and then the comment section tends to be trolly and hard and personal.
Yes.
It's been 5-6 years on digital for me. I should have been used to it, but I'm not. I'd like to say that it's getting easier, but it's not. It's hard. But I try as much as possible to, separate the trolls from the people who are genuinely sending feedback. If someone has genuinely sent me feedback, I write back to that person. But if someone is just trolling, and you can tell because there's a pattern in what they say. A lot of people will be saying the same thing, grammar-wise, spelling-wise. It's easy to pick out. The first time it happens, it's scary. Like, why are 1,000 people calling me this word? And then you realize they've all misspelled that word. So it's all from the same source.
Yeah, talking about the vicarious trauma, I think what we all do when we think of health, we think of our body health and we think of, what is the diet we are consuming in the sense of food.
Yes.
But none of us really think of what is the content diet we are feeding our mind. What we are feeding our body is different from what we are feeding our mind. And it's very important to, be clear how much do you want to feed your mind, especially in this age where there's just so much information available. And it must be tougher for you. I don't know how you decide what to feed your mind and what not to feed your
No,
mind.
because quite rightly, it's called a brain rot addiction, right? Because if we have 30 seconds, we take a break and we have 30 seconds, we're both going to be like,
Yes, yes.
And I've noticed that when I'm having to deal with something uncomfortable or something unpleasant has happened, it's easier for me to come out of that conversation on WhatsApp or email and go into Instagram and then scroll mindlessly because I feel like it's escaping the real world. So I'm aware that this is a genuine risk. I run a risk of like going down that rabbit hole. But the other the other thing that I've noticed that I've been doing from a mental health point of view is because, like I said, 30-second hits, right? So it's so fast. The information's coming fast. You're consuming it fast. Regular conversations that we have with regular people seem a little more tedious because the average person takes longer to get to the point. And you're just like, can you get there faster?
Get to the point.
And I think that there's a risk there of becoming impatient and snappy because we're sort of addicted to a faster pace. So I definitely recognize that from a mental health point of view, there's a challenge there. But I don't know how to, how does one get out of that addiction? It's just, I mean, if you're working in the news and you put your phone away, there's always that risk that something happens and you've missed it.
Yeah.
So yeah, I don't know the answer to the question. I wish I did. I don't know the answer to the question.
But to that, if we add one more role of yours, that is being a mother. So you anyway have a tough job. You've got to be, in a way, at work 24 hours and quick news, fact checking, so on. And then you are a young mother. You have a kid less than 3 years old.
Yes.
So how do you manage your work-life balance? Any tips for the younger mother?
Oh, good Lord. I wish I knew what I was doing to be able to help you, but I have no idea what I'm doing. I'm just taking it as it comes. I literally, every time someone asks me about parenting, I was just like, I have no idea what I'm doing. I feel like I'm hamming it every day. But because I'm trying to, as much as possible, not show my son a screen, it means that I have to also put my screen away.
Yes.
So it's instilling a certain level of discipline with me when I'm in his, with him. So if we're reading together, we're doing something together, I have to put my phone away. And the funny thing is now at 2.5 and nearly 3 years, he will come to me with a book and he really enjoys reading. And he'll say, can you read this for me? And if I'm scrolling my phone, he'll say, put your phone away and read this for me.
Yes.
So there's discipline teaching me something.
Yes.
I'm hoping that keeps me, sort of a little more grounded for a little longer, for as long as I can keep both of us off it. I find this word balance to be really dangerous for moms. And I remember asking you this question some 16, 17 years ago, because, I was just imagining it the other day. Who balances, right? Traditionally, a clown in a circus, right? It's a circus act to balance where you're on a unicycle and what does that feel like? You're holding in all of your muscles, you're holding in your breath, and you're trying to just keep everything upright for 20 years. It's impossible. So, every time someone says balance when it comes to moms, especially working moms, I'm like, you're suggesting the idea that we have to do this for 18 years. And that's what it feels like. It feels like you're just holding everything. Every muscle is being flexed and held in, and it's exhausting. And it does feel like that. So I don't really know how to balance. I wing it on a daily basis. I think most other women I speak to also wing it on it because you have an important appointment and your son wakes up with a fever. And now what are you going to do?
Yes.
Right? You have to figure this out somehow. And every day is a different. I mean, I regularly send my son to birthday parties without a present, without a gift, because
You've forgotten to organize it.
I have not managed to organize it. I don't have it on time. And I messaged the mom saying, "Hey, dude, I don't have a gift. I'm just sending this child. Just take him." So I do a lot of that because I realize that I cannot possibly stay on top of everything. I try to, sort of get by the best I can. But you should tell us because you've done this successfully. So how did you do it?
I think that, it's about prioritizing each moment.
Right.
And the life still has to be a complete whole. So you, in your life, you have the same amount of importance for yourself, for your family, for your work, for society, for your extended family, whatever is a part of your life. So you can't say that I'll prioritize work over family or family over work and so on. But for that moment, you have to pick that priority. So as you said, if the child wakes up with very high fever, then maybe that day you cancel your meeting. There's nothing else that you can do. But the next day, if you have a very important board meeting, then even if my child had a very important match to play, I would leave that and go for the board meeting. So every moment you choose your priority, but make sure that your life is a complete whole.
How do you battle this feeling? The fact that before I became a mom, I knew what I was capable of work-wise.
Mhm.
And I know that on any given day, I'm not able to give that much because my energy is being divided. I also know that I'm not giving that much at home either because my energy is divided in the opposite direction. So there's this constant feeling of, I don't know if guilt is the right word. I know a lot of people use the word guilt, but also this just, I could be amazing if I had more time or if I was able to give more. Did you feel that way?
So, what's wrong in feeling that way? I mean, anybody who had more time to do something would do it better. So, what's wrong in feeling that way? You made a choice that you would give some time to your work and some time to your family. And as I said,
Yeah.
you will be broadly very sensible that you will not just go to office when your child
Yeah.
is, with very high fever and vice versa. So, you would be broadly sensible about it. But yes, if you had more time, I mean, even for a chef, if he had more time or she had more time, she'll perfect the dish more and more and more. That's the fact of life. You make a choice that you're going to do it all, and you try and do it all to your best. And every moment you would not be doing everything best.
Yeah.
But I think overall in life, you will manage a good life.
So when you look back now at the entire journey, what's the one thing that you would say was the most successful sort of hack or idea that you used to get through those years?
Oh, I think the belief that let some things be the way they happen. you know? So,
Oh.
so you would make a very perfect menu for your kid
Mm,
and say,
mm.
no butter, no sugar, no this, no that, and this is what the kid is going to eat. But you know very well the grandparents are there
Yeah.
and they would definitely give French fries to the kid. Don't get hyper about it. You chose to be in office. Let
Yeah,
that
yeah,
happen.
yeah.
You sitting in office and getting hyper about whether my kid is eating French fries is not on. You are neither doing work nor are you
Yeah,
present
yeah,
with the kid.
yeah.
So I think some things you have to let them happen, but broadly you have to take charge. So Faye, being a social media content creator yourself, I'm sure you measure your reach, your engagement, and so on. And I think you have what 1.9 million followers on Instagram. Wow, fantastic! But beyond the numbers, personally to you, how do you measure your success in your role? I mean, what matters to you when you say or you think that this is how you're creating impact?
So I'm a little wary of the numbers
Hmm.
also.
Mm-hmm.
So I know ballpark where the numbers are on an average week because someone might ask me. So I know that we are at 1.9 and I know that, we do 100 million. On a good week, we do 100 million views per month on Instagram. If
Okay.
it's a big week, so if there's an election, then we'll go up to 250 million views.
Uh-huh.
But after that, I don't go into the views per story
Okay.
or per reel or per YouTube video that much because it's just digital TRPs. For me, my unit of measure has always been the comment section.
Oh, okay.
So is is this triggering enough discussion?
Hmm.
So if you see a lot of content on the internet, the comment section will just be thumbs ups and smileys and hearts. But I feel good if I've put out a story and it's triggered debate.
Hmm.
Where people are coming and writing coherent arguments. And so in my mind, I've put out a piece of information and there's positive debate happening. So people are actually thinking about it. They're forming opinions. They're listening to each other. They're responding to each other. So it's triggered thought.
Right.
For me, that's that's the impact. And of course, I personally love it whenever someone meets me randomly in a public place and says, "Hey, I really liked that," or "I read this story," or "I was just reading your news before I met you." I love that. That really makes my day. So I don't actually go by the numbers, although I do have to keep an eye on it because otherwise you don't know if you're making an impact. But I like the comment section as a good indicator of the impact of the work that's happening.
Another impact of your work, if even if you look at if you look at Raima Sen, the actress,
Yes.
she said that when she had to prepare for her role in the movie The Vaccine War, she Googled Faye D'Souza. So that's a huge compliment. But tell me, having become that in that sense, the role model, or how do you handle that responsibility? Do you think you've become more mindful of how you present yourself on the screen, off the screen?
So I'm more mindful of the responsibility of that credibility, of the relationship. So I feel like, unlike news on a newspaper or on television, independent news is more personal,
Hmm.
not personalized. So, in the sense that it's not like I'm trying to figure out, because I can't figure out what your liking is and only give you the news that you like. But it's personal in the sense that every reader feels they have a relationship with me. And it's not a brand, but it's a person. So we've sort of built that relationship together. And I feel the weight of that responsibility. So one of the things that I always do, and I do it personally, is whenever we get something wrong, and we do get things wrong because we're human beings, sometimes when we make a mistake, when we're checking, our fact checking goes off or it's not accurate, I always personally type out an apology. And I always post an apology saying, hey, we made this mistake and I'm really sorry. But I think that it's really important to that credibility. And I always felt that you cannot build credibility overnight. It's like this. You build it every day, you put one brick in and one brick and one brick. And over a period of years, you wind up building this structure of credibility. I have to own up to the fact that I got something wrong. And it takes a lot out of me, but I do it every time. And I do it myself so that I feel that weight and I feel that relationship.
Talking about journalism as an industry, uh, something that is impacting every industry or every profession is the technology disruption. You touched upon it earlier as well, the artificial intelligence.
Yeah.
And now you can have AI bots who would write stories for you, who can even take over or handle a social media platform, who can
Yeah.
almost become a weather anchor and so on. So, what do you think that's doing to the journalism industry? Because, on the other hand, I also feel that this is an industry that needs that human touch, that sensibility, sensitivity, and so on.
So I don't think it's done anything yet. At least in India, we're a lot slower in sort of doing these things. I think a weather report done by AI is a gimmick. That's not the real impact. The real impact is in the back end.
Okay.
So obviously, AI can copy check or can generate copy much faster than human beings. So large scale copy can be generated by AI, or if someone has got the copy, it can be translated, it can be copy checked, it can be page design, which used to require a human being to sort of like, oh, make this
Place
easier
it here, yeah.
that newspaper design or the website page design can happen much faster. Just designing of apps can happen much faster. Uh, Editing of videos, generating thumbnails, generating descriptions, giving you the intel to decide what video is trending, what topic you should do a video on. So, for example, let's assume we want to do a video on startups in India. and you ask your AI bot that question, and it'll say, these are the various angles that you can look at in this video. So you can look at, the fundraise, you can look at the valuation, you can look at the unicorns, you can also all of these things.
Mhm.
So it can generate all these things which would otherwise take a human being hours of work to do. So there's all of that positive stuff that's happening. On the negative stuff, the more we ask AI to generate things for us, the more AI will learn how to do these things without us. Which means that tomorrow, if I know that Chanda Kochhar reads the Washington Post or the Economist, I can generate for you a page that looks and feels and reads exactly like that,
Mhm.
but it's not real.
Oh,
And you, as an audience member, will not be able to
able
tell
to
the
tell.
difference.
Oh.
The more you do videos like this, I can, as AI, tomorrow generate an entire video that looks like Chanda Kochhar, sounds like you, blinks and talks and, same accent, everything, but it's not you. So that is the big risk that I said is coming, which is going to perhaps upend journalism across the globe, not just in India. And nobody is prepared because the software to create the fake videos, the fake audios, the fake news stories is changing every day.
Mm.
But the detection software to be able to detect that this video is fake, that's the program that's been abandoned. So I think that it's a new world we are entering. It's a scary world from my point of view. So technology is going to uh, maybe reduce manpower in newsrooms, change the way news is processed on the back end, change the way news is analyzed on the front end. But this is the bigger risk, the bigger change.
With this kind of change, do you think we are, keeping the next generation of journalists kind of trained enough?
The next generation of journalists are barely being trained in journalism. The guys who are already in jobs don't know how to handle this new tech. It's like I said, it's like a massive tsunami. It's going to knock us all sideways. We're not prepared.
So, what's the one piece of advice you'd give to people who are entering this stream or industry now?
Have faith. And I'm using the word faith is because faith is what you have to do when there's no evidence. Have faith that all is not lost.
Hmm.
A lot of people feel like, oh, is journalism dead? I get asked this question a lot. And I believe in my bones that the democracy cannot function without good journalism.
Yeah.
And so if the democracy is alive, journalism is alive. And if journalism is alive, the democracy is alive. So there are a lot of smaller organizations all over the country who are doing great work. So in India, for example, we have on YouTube tribal people who only track tribal affairs.
Oh.
We have several Dalit specific voices and channels. We have channels that track women in Uttar Pradesh and rural Uttar Pradesh. There's one organization that only tracks Coimbatore. There are organizations that only track the South in specific languages. So it's almost like a giant carpet, a tapestry of independent journalists who are each doing pockets of various different things. So if you look hard enough, there is great work that's happening, and you can find people to work with if you're a young person who really wants to do this. The going is hard, but it's not impossible.
And you have to keep up with that.
Yes.
Faith and conviction.
Yeah, in the faith and conviction.
So, as you said, journalism to change the world or
Yes.
make an impact. Talking about some issues, like, for example, climate change. I mean, it's not a far off issue. It's
Not
real.
anymore,
It's
yeah.
here. You've covered a lot of it, but do you think journalism is, giving it the right importance?
No. Short answer is no.
Short answer is no. But
Short
what
answer.
can be done?
But there are some great journalists all over the world who are tracking climate change.
Mm.
The problem is that it's not getting front page.
Yeah, not becoming the center.
It's not becoming the center. It's not. It's like that film that came out, Don't Look Up, right? Where this is the main thing, but nobody wants to make it the main thing. So the thing about climate change is that even though in India we're making massive strides in renewable energy, we're doing massive things to to bring in more electric vehicles, to make a lot of changes on the ground. But unless the change is worldwide, it will still impact us. And India will feel the impact of climate change perhaps a lot more than the rest of the world because we have more poor people who aren't able to insulate themselves. I read this data point that said that in the next 2 decades, India's cooling needs for electricity will be India's total electricity need right now.
Oh,
So our total demand for energy will only be needed for cooling
because
in a
of-
couple of decades
because of the
heat,
warming, yeah.
because of warming, and because more and more people in India will be able to afford air conditioning, and they're going to want it. Why not? And so we'll have all of these needs that we'll need to address. And the more we cool, the more we will heat. And so all of these things are going to happen. But to what extent we are not able to answer.
Also, sustainability in that sense. I mean,
Yeah.
it's not just about business, it's about economic growth.
Yeah.
So, sustainability, very important to save our planet. How do you balance that with economic growth?
I think that where we're failing, and perhaps also as media we're failing, is to be able to put this into perspective right now. The air pollution that we're dealing with, on one hand, we have construction that says it's too expensive for us to bring in the European standards and be able to build in such a way that we're not creating dust. But if we look at it holistically, what are the healthcare costs and the burden on the city when our children are constantly falling sick, our employees are constantly falling sick, people are getting stuck in traffic, people are filling up in hospitals, we're putting pressure on the healthcare system. Unfortunately, we're not able to see all of this on the same chart. So we're looking at a cost benefit for business separately, and we're not looking at the healthcare cost at all. But all of these things are costs. So in a city like Bangalore, and I feel really strongly about this, we have massive businesses in Bangalore that have invested money, but are unable to demand a better quality of life for their employees who are spending half their time in traffic.
On the road, yeah.
Those are, I know, for a lot of CEOs, great billable hours. For a lot of employees, time that can be spent with family, but this is time that's getting wasted. And this is productivity that's getting wasted. And we're not able to put all of this on the chart and say, is there a way this can be done better? Is there a way we can improve transit? Is there a way that we can improve the air? We can improve quality of life so as to improve productivity, thereby improve business. We're not able to make those arguments. And I think the media might have, some blame to take there.
Because with more and more awareness, I think what's required is that sustainability as a thinking becomes a part of DNA. Yes, whether the organization or the nation or the person or the community,
Yeah.
That is what allows you to take a kind of holistic view then.
Yes. And I think that collective responsibility, right?
Yes.
We have to push to do better. And we've seen, for example, Beijing has solved that problem. So it's possible to solve it. We just have to push for that solution. Other cities have solved the traffic problem. So it's possible to solve it. We just have to push for those solutions. We're not pushing right now. And I think that's because the media is not able to arm people with the adequate argument and the understanding of that problem. And that's where our issue is.
Diversity, equity, inclusion, DEI.
I want to cry.
Not spoken about it, but has the needle moved?
It's moved a great deal. I mean, we've seen a rollback in the West right now. And I think that's a dangerous thing. But I think in our workspaces, there are some excellent companies in India that have set great examples. The Lalit Hotels Group, for example, does amazing work. If you don't know, you should totally check them out. They've got their diversity includes LGBTQI people of all across, so trans people working in their hotels. They've got people of disability at all levels. They will set up a wedding in their hotel and make it wheelchair friendly. So they're thinking at a very different level. Godrej, for example, is doing a lot of work is similarly where diversity is not just gender, but it's also disability of all levels, including learning disabilities that they have found ways to integrate into their workforce. It's diversity in terms of LGBTQI. And this is not just integrating people into the workforce, but arming existing employees, managers with the sensitivity to be able to welcome, not bully, not subconsciously sort of create a bias, but actually create a uniform workspace. It's amazing work, and it can be sort of replicated across the board. I don't think it's all lost. I think we've done a fair amount of work there. I genuinely believe that the more women we have as role models and as leaders, better changes there will be. And that needs to be then, that learning needs to be applied across that spectrum. So, which means we need to have more members of the LGBTQI community lead businesses publicly.
And make that
And
role model.
You can then make those changes. We need to have more people with disability run businesses so they can then bring that experience and integrate more people from that community into the workspaces. I think that with women, there has been certain examples have been set that can be learned from and applied for other people within the DEI space as well.
Yes, because diversity is not just about women. It's not just about gender. It is much more comprehensive. And also, it's not just about numbers. I think it's about not just getting the diverse people, but creating an environment that makes them comfortable and allows them to flourish. Of course, on their merits, but allows them to flourish.
So a lot of the conversation should be at the policy level. So when you're designing policies in a workspace, is it designed for everyone in the DEI community? And not just an afterthought saying, oh, we have this one employee who has a wheelchair. Now let's figure out how we can get this person to move around the office. Or we have this one employee now who's visually impaired. Now let's figure out how we can make this possible. But it needs to already be there. And that's the, that's the thinking leap that's going to, that's going to need to get done.
Yeah. Of course, you've been a champion of women empowerment, but in comparison to other industries, do you think journalism offers more space for women?
So again, a large number of women joining at the entry level. I think there was a study done recently to show that diversity at the top, in the corner office of the editors, a large portion, more than 95%, are male, upper caste men. I mean, they're just upper caste men. So it's a very small fraction that is running communication across the board. So there aren't enough women. There aren't enough religious minority people. There aren't enough people of different castes.
Economic strata.
Which means then that your stories will get told and your pages will get designed based on one perspective. That person might do it in their best intention, but you do not have the lived experience of 98% of society. And that's a challenge. Because when you have more people of diversity making decisions, you'll have better outcomes.
Of course.
I remember, when I was running the television channel, there was this once, we would sit in a room and discuss what story needs to be our lead story of the day. And because I was there were a lot more women in the room. And those women would be far more vocal about, this is important. This needs to be the story of the day. And that's the story that we would take. So there needs to be more and more and voices that can be heard in decision making.
Yes.
Not just numbers who are tucked away in various parts of your office, but voices who are in the room when you're making decisions. So like it was said, nothing about me without me. So you don't make any decisions without including the right number of people. So there's so much to be done, but I think that more and more as we have leaders who are thinking this way, we'll have changes on the ground.
Okay. Yes. I would always say that if we had more women sitting in the design teams for automobile cars, you'll find a better way to place your bag for the driver.
Pedals that you can reach.
Yes.
And seatbelts that fit you correctly. I always feel like I'm being choked by the seatbelt when I'm in the driver's seat. This is on my neck. I'm like, this is not where it's supposed to be. But you did that. I remember you changed how banking was seen in India. And you had a couple of colleagues as well who then you all went ahead different banks at the same time. And we went from a space where banking was seen completely as a suit,
Yeah.
a man's job into, I mean, it opened careers for hundreds of thousands of women across the country. I thought it was amazing. And it was just about role modeling and, just showing that it's possible, that this can be done. And then everybody automatically says, oh, okay, it's possible. So I'm going to do it next. And just for little girls to be able to see that this can be done, I think that, that changes everything.
So, who are the women in your life that shaped you into the person that you are today?
So I have two older sisters
Hmm.
and a younger brother. So we grew up in a sort of a gender biased because there were more women than men. So my mom and my older sisters are very strong women, and they sort of, and including my dad, they placed a foundation on being really independent.
Okay.
So from the time I think when we were about 12 or 13, we were all taught how to cook, including my brother,
Hmm.
how to change a car tire. So my dad, I remember, did not allow me when I grew up and was able to buy my first car myself, but didn't allow me to drive it until I learned how to change a car tire myself. Because he said you should never be stranded on the side of the road waiting for someone to come and help you. You should know how to do this yourself. We learned how to do rudimentary electrical work, plumbing work, how to fix a fuse.
Okay.
So that how to wash our own clothes, how to do our own, dishes, so that we are
Including your brother was.
including my brother. No difference there, including my brother, because it was seen as a life skill. That you can't go through the world not knowing how to do these things, because you should never have to wait for someone to come and help you. You should know how to fix things on your own. And I think that laid a foundation of just belief that as a woman or as a girl, that I can fix it. I am not in distress. I don't need someone to come and rescue me. That I would love to have someone in my life, but I don't need someone to, sort of keep me safe. That then led me to believe that I'm strong enough to do whatever it is I wanted to do. Um, Including as a reporter, you wind up going into weird spaces and, places that are not necessarily safe.
Safety, yeah.
And you believe that you have every right to be there as any male colleague of yours. Um, in fact, in my career, I don't think I encountered any active sexism on the field at all. And I've had the good fortune as a reporter to constantly interact with women who were impressive and amazing, like yourself, for example. So you have the opportunity to interview people, to meet people, to learn from them, to ask them questions from your mind. And I think that there's a constant series of women then that you meet and you encounter who inspire you. So I mean, the world is full of amazing women.
Is there any particular cause that's close to your heart where you think you want to make a long-term impact?
Um, I mean, obviously, the cause for women, I feel most strongly about. Um, to have more women in positions of power, to have more women in decision making, uh, to have more women in the workforce, to have more girls in school and in college.
So very important. Yeah.
And in a powerful way, not, not pulled out when they start their periods, or not having to drop out because their college is too far away, or they get, they get harassed on the street if they stay out too long.
Or that if the parents have to choose that they can educate only
Only
one kid,
one.
it'll be the brother.
Yeah,
and not-
yeah. The idea that if we adequately feed our girls in our country, we can change the fortune of the next generation, because stronger women who are better educated will give birth to stronger babies, and they will have the ability to lift
bring-
themselves out of poverty.
Yeah.
And it all comes down to just feeding our girls. It's such a simple solution, and keeping them in school and giving them access. I mean, research in India has shown that if an Indian girl or an Indian woman is given access to information and help, so she will always make the right decision for her family. So she will manage the family planning. She will manage the education of her children. She will manage the nutrition of her children if she's given access and empowerment. I mean, that's something I feel really strongly about.
Because when you empower a woman, you are actually empowering the entire family, because
Yeah.
she would take the
Yeah.
entire family up, in whether it's in terms
Yes.
of education, in terms of better standard of
Right,
living, or
right,
anything. Yeah.
So I think in India we have, and this is such a stark reminder. In India we have free um, birth control, the Maladi program of the 90s and the 80s. So if a woman has access to a primary healthcare center, she'll get free birth control in India, and she'll get the nutrition needs and the information that she needs. And research has shown that every time, irrespective of language, age, religion, community, if a woman is given information and access, she will make the right decision.
Yeah.
Because she will find a way to choose what is best for her family, irrespective of what her society is telling her to do. And that's such a beautiful
Yes.
story, right? And so we can, all we have to do is just empower them, to find the women, use the Anganwadi program, empower our girls, feed them adequately, give them enough iron so they're not anemic. And anemic girls will give birth to underweight, malnourished children. And so if these children at 0 to 5 are not adequately fed,
Yeah.
it doesn't matter what opportunities you make available at adulthood, they cannot compete.
Yes.
So these are actually like base problems that we need to find solutions for. And the key is in the girls.
Yes. Yes, absolutely. You've had a show on YouTube for very long. I'm, of course, new to this. And you've interviewed, various people across diverse kind of walks of life and so on. So, what goes into your selecting a guest? Is it the topic of discussion, or is it the interesting personality that determines your choice of the guest?
It's all of those things. My recent show has been about failure, which I really love, because I feel like we're filling the world with information about success. And we're not talking enough about our moments of failure and our moments of vulnerability and the moments when it's really difficult to get out of bed. So, what I do is I call really successful people on the show and I ask them about when they failed. And the stories are just fascinating and they're so raw. And we learn so much. So, from that point of view, I just really love talking to everybody. I mean, interesting people, because everyone has a great story about a moment when you thought that, oh my God, my career is over. But then there's no, unlike the storybooks, your story doesn't end there. You have to wake up the next morning and do life again.
Yes.
And so you have to keep moving. And
Right.
that's that's the answer to failure, is that you just keep moving. And everybody has such beautiful stories that we've, each show is better than the next. So for me, if it's news, it's about the topic of discussion. But if it's on the YouTube, if it's on our podcast, then it's about the interesting people with, beautiful stories and lives that have been beautifully led.
Because there's inspiration in everything. There's inspiration in success. There's inspiration in how you handle failure.
And how you handle failure. Yeah. Because I think the problem with talking constantly about success is that we build an idea that, oh, there must be something wrong with you if you're not a billionaire right now. But the answer is, it's not that simple. And success is measured in different ways.
Yes, absolutely.
Because failure is measured in different ways.
Yes.
And there's making $1 billion is not a finish line in any way. And that doesn't mean that that individual is now happy and sorted.
No, because again, for them, the satisfaction is only relative.
Yeah, everybody's satisfaction is relative, but that's such an important thing, right? And how we measure, and it's so important right now, I think, especially for our younger people, to put out this information that there are different aspects to your life. And a combination of success on all of these things at various levels is how you should look at your life. So, do you have a good conscience? Is it clean? Can you sleep at night? Is so important. Are you able to win the respect and the love of the people around you? Are you a good friend? Are you a good parent? Are you trying? We're all always trying to be good daughters and good parents and good employees and good citizens. And, sometimes we're failing, sometimes we're succeeding, but we're all trying. And it's that makes us good human beings. And somehow I feel that gets lost in the conversations that we're having.
True. But your own journey, I mean, it's not been easy. I'm sure a lot of hard work and so on, as you explained as well. So, was there any unscripted moment that kind of changed you and made you this powerful voice that you are today?
I think all the moments were unscripted. I don't think anything was scripted here. It was all, tumbling into things by accident. I think the main moment for me was when I left television, and it happened quite suddenly. It happened overnight. It was quite sudden. And after some 17 years of working a very demanding job, to a point where I had not invested in my personal life at all. I mean, I have a partner and a husband who has always been extremely supportive, but that was it. I would just go to office and spend all my day in office, and I would come back at 11 o'clock at night, and that was my life. And suddenly I woke up in the morning and had nowhere to go because there was no work. And like you said, mental health is such an important thing. And it was every morning when you live in a building, there's this activity that begins at about 8 o'clock where people are suddenly leaving. Kids are going to school and people are going to office and cars are moving out, and there's a lot of activity. And I'd be sitting there in my pajamas with nowhere to go. And I started to get anxious, especially, when my husband would leave for work every day, I would get more and more anxious. And I started to have physical anxiety. I couldn't breathe. And, I started getting worried. And then I realized that I needed help and I needed to see a professional. And I went to see a psychiatrist.
Okay.
And I put myself through therapy to find my way out and asking myself what I want to do with my life. Do I want to be a journalist? What kind? That was part of that entire exercise of actually stopping and saying, I've gotten to this point. There are no obvious ways forward. What do I do? That was really scary for me because up until then, and I think those of us who were kids in the 80s sort of had our lives chalked out for us that, oh, you'll do this, then you'll go to college, then you'll do a master's, then you'll start working, and then, you'll get married. And it was all laid out. It was sort of
Yes.
obvious. And I had not taken a break per se at all.
Mm-hmm.
There was no stopping in my entire life until that point. And it was terrifying. I didn't know what I was going to do. And like I said, I just stumbled from one thing to another. So I didn't have a master plan and I couldn't understand it. And I think COVID happened. I stumbled into one more thing after that. So it was largely unscripted, but it was very scary. It was, a terrifying thing for me to not have a job and to not have a plan and to not know what I was going to do. So it's still scary. I'm still scared on most days. And there's a part of me is like, would I just be happier if I just had a job with a salary? Would it be easier to handle? But yeah, a lot of my life has been unscripted.
So we come to the last section of my show where I just want you to give me very spontaneous and very quick answers to my
Okay.
questions. So let's start. Serious interviews or casual chats?
Casual chats.
Mm-hmm. Those are more interesting for you.
Yes.
What do you prefer watching more? Documentaries, reality TV, or web series?
Web series.
So let's talk about web series. How did your cameo in Call Me Bae happen? And any fun moment behind the scenes that you'd
So
want to share?
actually, that was I had gone to Guneet Monga's wedding party. There was a cocktail, and I was standing at the bar, as one does, and there were these. They were the writers of the show
Huh.
who work with Dharma Productions were also at the bar. They said, hey, and we introduced each other. We said hi, and they said, we're working on this show about a journalist. It's sort of about a journalist, but it's fun and it's vaguely based on, a story of a woman who leaves television. So it's straight up, you'd love it. And then they said, do you think you'll do like one scene for us? And I said, okay. And at that point, I didn't know how big the show was going to be. So I said, hi, I'll do it. It's okay. So, and it took a few months for them to line up the dates. And then they, it was just literally one day's work. And by the time we had the discussion, I just had my baby at that time.
Okay.
So I was technically still on mat leave. And I said, yeah, okay, I'll do it. It was one day. So I went and we shot and it was fun. And I had no context to the rest of the show. I only knew that one, that one scene that I was part of. I didn't think it would get the kind of attention it got. It was supposed to just be like a fun,
Fun
like a fun one day thing.
Hmm. What's your favorite talk show, or rather, who's your favorite talk show host?
Oh, um, okay. So people don't know this, but I really like Karan Johar.
Uh-huh.
I think he's funny and intelligent, and I enjoy watching him. Um, I've always been an Oprah fan.
Okay.
Um, on the news front, I've been a Christiane Amanpour fan. Yeah.
So tell me a favorite film or a song that you would keep going back to for inspiration or just for comfort.
So see, I grew up in Bangalore.
Mm.
So South Indian music, but A.R. Rahman.
Huh.
So I find that A.R. Rahman's music it just never goes out of style. So if you're in a mood of any kind and you find best of A.R. Rahman and you play it, it will always work. So I've always loved his music. I feel like it speaks personally. It sort of strikes a note. Um, and favorite everything is Shah Rukh Khan. So that checks all the answers. Favorite film, favorite actor, favorite whatever.
Do you see yourself ever writing a book?
Yes. If I have the discipline to sit down and actually do the writing, there are, I think, a couple of books that should be written.
Those would be about what?
I'd like to tell my story. Um, I'd like to write a book about women in finance and women investing their own money and sort of taking control of their own space. I'd love to write a book for kids on how to understand money better. I think these are, important topics. So yes, there are many things that one can work on.
In your career, any particular story or moment that really touched you, which, kind of made you feel that, yes, this is why I do what I do?
Oh, there've been many. We did a campaign to remove child locks from taxis in India.
Mm-hmm.
So the concept of a child lock is a very Western concept where they have children sitting in the back by themselves.
Yes.
In India, in a taxi, you'll never have a child sitting alone in the back of the car. You'll always have a parent with them. So technically in a taxi, you don't need a child lock. But what it was being used for was to lock women into cars. And there were a lot of abuse cases where basically it's a switch in the door of a car. And a lot of us don't know that it's there. So we ran a campaign where we put out information onto where to find that switch. So when you're getting in, check to make sure it's not locked, because then you can't open the door from the inside and the driver can take you wherever he wants. And I also then met various state governments and explained the challenge. And then there was a rule brought in that when a car was being registered as a taxi, that mechanism needs to be, dismantled, because taxis don't need child locks. And I feel that if that has saved even one woman from abuse or assault, then that's why we do this job.
Yes. The one thing that you feel or you wish that someone had told the 18-year-old Faye about this industry?
To believe that you can change the world even when it seems impossible. And I think that when we start off doing anything idealistically and we come out of college like, so idealistic, thinking, I want to change the world, we forget that even the ordinary days when nothing happens and you're doing a job and it feels like crap, even those days add up to a cumulative impact. And our jobs and our careers and our lives are about a cumulative impact. And there will be days that don't seem great. And that's okay. It's okay. And I really wish someone would tell all of the young people today that you're not going to be rich and famous straight off the barn door. That it's going to take time. And there are going to be days that feel completely listless and unmotivated and you're going to feel like, why am I here? And this is going to happen in your personal life, in your professional life, in your relationships. But it's a cumulative journey of, hopefully for everyone, 40 years that, will add into something. And it's okay to sort of not feel fantastic every day and hang in there.
One myth about journalists that you would want to bust.
That we don't make a lot of money. Like I keep telling people that, you will not sleep on silk sheets, but you'll sleep really well. So if you're a good journalist, you're not going to make a lot of money, but you'll have great impact. You'll have great respect, and you'll have a really good and strong conscience.
Yeah, there's a huge
Yeah.
value to that. That's what I was going to say. So, Hmm. If you could switch careers for a day, what would you do?
I think I'd be a chef.
Oh,
Yeah.
I thought you'd say maybe go back to the web series.
I always really loved food, and I love the satisfaction of like cooking and feeding people.
Hmm.
So I think that if I was in a different sector, I'd probably be in the F&B, the food and beverage sector.
Oh, nice. If you could go back and, into history and cover any event firsthand,
Hmm.
which event would you like to cover?
So I would love to have interviewed Dr. B.R. Ambedkar.
Hmm.
I'm a big fan.
Hmm.
I've read a lot of his work. I think he was a fascinating individual. I think that for those of us who admire his work, we have a lot of his writing, but nobody asked him questions about what he thinks and what he believes. Like, we don't know him as a person.
Hmm.
I would have loved
You
to
only know the
know him.
Constitution.
Yeah, we already know, his
Yeah.
main serious work.
Yes.
No one spent enough time sort of exploring who he was as a person. We only know what he's written in his own autobiography. Um, I would have loved to be in an audience at some point and listen to Gandhi speak and maybe cover that. Um, when Gandhi came to India from South Africa, he spent, I think, a year, maybe more, just traveling and understanding the country.
He
I-
even went to the Kumbh Mela to
Yes.
understand, the
Yes.
spirit behind
Yes.
it. Yes.
I would have loved to have been a sort of beach reporter, just following him around and just covering it. Just covering what he did.
Nice. And if you could interview any fictional character, which character would that be?
A fictional character.
Any comics that you like?
All of them. I would love to sit down with Daenerys Targaryen from the Game of Thrones. I have this thing for strong women.
Okay. You spoke about food and being a foodie. So, rice and fish curry or pori idli for lunch?
But rice and fish curry for all meals. So I'm South Indian, so all South Indian food. I'm Mangalorean specifically, so neer dosa for lunch
Okay.
and rice and fish curry for for lunch and dinner.
And my final question, which is a tougher role, being a mother or being a journalist?
Being a mother. Because being a journalist, you have training, and it sort of prepares you for what you need to do. But I feel like being a mom every day is a new challenge, and you're sort of just winging it. And now I have all of this information that I don't need to use because I'm past that stage. But I know I have so many years of new challenges ahead of me. Nobody prepares you for what's coming.
Nobody does. Yeah. Until you become a mother, you've not gone through that training.
Yes. So this,
It's learning on the job.
I was telling someone, it's the first job I've had where I've had zero training.
Yes.
And the stakes are 0 to 100. So any mistake you make, you feel like you're going to totally blow this up.
It's been an incredibly interesting conversation. Oh, your insights into journalism, your perspectives about various issues that matter. It's been very inspirational and very refreshing. So
It has been such a pleasure to sit down with you. I've really enjoyed it.
thank you. Thank you for being here and wishing you all the best.
Thank you for having me.